Hello, everyone. It's good to see so many people interested in making games. We used to be a room way smaller than this, and it can take all of us. Which is the working end. Who are we and who am I? My name is Gabriel. I'm CEO of Haemimont Games. I've been making games for the last about 20 years. The most known title from Haemimont Games, our latest games, are Tropico, Victor Run, and Surviving Mars. Maybe you've heard some of them, maybe you haven't. I'm going to talk today about the stories in games and how do we incorporate them. The first thing I want to say is that what I'm saying is not how it's done. What I'm saying is what we learned throughout all these years. And things in the game industry are changing all the time. So take what I'm saying right now as your starting point for exploration and for finding your own ways of incorporating the stories in games, because the best games are really made by people who try something new and try something that hasn't been done before. So the things that I'm going to talk about are just something to consider and to begin with, and then proceed further. While I was thinking about the lecture and sitting in the Soviet Army monument, I was thinking what to say, and then all of a sudden I was sitting on the bench. There came this tiger right next to me, and my just heart rate went up like crazy, and I felt immediately the rush of blood, and the tiger was like really this close and coming closer, and then he just licked me. And I heard like, Max, come here, don't scare off people. The reason I'm telling you this is that stories do work. And the way we are built is to communicate through stories. And it's regardless whether the story makes any sense, whether it's appropriate, whether it has anything to do with what you're talking about. You will see that half an hour after the end of the lecture, you're most likely to remember about the tiger and absolutely nothing else. So the stories are the way that we are communicating with the world. That's the reason why they're so effective. This is something that we've been training and getting better at for hundreds of thousands of years, and their creation and their use have been evolving together with the language for all these years. And the ancient tribe gathering together in the evening before they go to sleep, and later on when there was a fire, they will be talking and sharing all these experiences. And this is our way, the human way, of actually allowing our experience to teach the other people and to learn from what happened to other people that not necessarily happened to us. We are also very, very conditioned to receive stories. All the movies, all the songs, even the brands have recognized the power of stories. So every brand has kind of this magical story about what it stands for, even though it's just a bunch of people trying to make money. So we are very, very much ready to receive whatever story. This is something very built within us. And that's the main reason why we want to use stories in games, because they just work. A few things about stories. Good stories invoke emotions, and that's true about good games as well. So that's, again, one more reason why stories are very good for being part of games. You know, the basic emotions, the different lists vary, but this is pretty much a starting point. There is also other things. It's interesting to think about a game that invokes primarily one of these emotions. And there is absolutely games that invoke all of them and then some. Another very important thing for a story to work is that it has to have relatable characters and events. They have to have something common with the person who's receiving the story. If they don't, it just doesn't work as strong, and the relation is gone, and there is not that much of a connection. For example, Harry Potter is a book about children, and unsurprisingly, the main character is a child, and that child feels that at sometimes his vision of the world has been neglected by the parents, Interestingly, that's also in the book, and that's what happens with a lot of children around. That child is being punished, of course, unfairly, as you can imagine, from the point of view of any child. And that also happens within the book. So for a child, it's very, very easy to relate to that character. If the exact same thing had happened, but to this old man into a retirement home, that whole thing will not be exactly very popular with children, would it? So that's the thing. You should always look to have characters and events that the players and the people who read the story can relate to. At the same time, they have to be fresh. They have to give them some new experience. And in the case with Harry Potter, it actually very fairly treats the theme of having magic in our world. And nobody will forget the 8:30 train or any of the other magical things happening around, and the separation between this casual world where people don't believe and don't know about, and this magical world where a lot of children have dreamed being of, and now it's being shown on the screen. There is other people believing in it, and so on and so forth. And of course, there is also the traditional story, making good story kind of advice that I will not go into a lot of depth here, which is having a conflict, having reveals throughout the story, having reversals throughout the story. The interesting thing is that you can think of your stories that you're incorporating in your games and try to see where all those elements are, and if you can, maybe include a little bit more or make some of them stronger. An interesting thing about games is that they not only allow us to communicate stories, but they allow the players to create their own stories. And arguably, the most successful games have been the ones that allow the players to create their own story instead of being witnesses of a story that somebody else created. And again, the reason is engagement. Yes, the best story that a writer can write is probably way better than what will happen the first playthrough of Minecraft that you have. You will just dig some random holes in the ground that fall in one of it, fail to get out of it, and then a monster will come and eat you during the night. That's not very exciting, but that's your story. And that's the difference between presenting players with a fixed story, that it could be a great one, and allowing them to create their own story because they feel the ownership of their own story, and they like it so much better for that. Typically, strategy and simulation games, for example, Civilization, are games that are allowing the player to create stories. And there is also typically RPGs and adventure games. I gave an example, Porter here, but any popular RPG will be games that just have a sort of a more fixed story, and then you're experiencing as you play. The engagement is, again, a little bit more being part of the story and experiencing what's happening around you as you're playing the game, or it could be more a presentation which is non-interactive. That's the only difference. Of course, since we're making games, outside of the cutscenes, pretty much everything else is interactive, but still there is a wide spectrum between watching your story cut into several cutscenes and being part of it throughout. And again, the games that allow the players to create stories are always more on the experiencing end, because the players experience their story as they're creating it, as opposed to the story being delivered to them. You can have a lot of different stories in games. There is the backstory, the general atmosphere, the story of the world and how it came to exist. You can argue that the Bible could be just as complete and could have the same message if it did not include the creation, the entire Genesis part, but that's something that you can include, and that will provide a lot more completeness of the experience that you are creating. You can have the generally main story within the game, or different parts and smaller stories. You can have hundreds of smaller events that are not really part of one story, but each one of them is like telling a small joke, a small story within the game environment. So you can have multiple stories thrown out in your game. And there is also the meta stories. These are the tournaments and Twitch streamers and all the stories that they're creating using your game, but these are not necessarily things that you have you thought about or you came up with. These are things that they came up with, you just gave them the tools, but still most interesting playthroughs could be by somebody who just decided to try the game in a completely different way. We had an experience with that when Quill started playing Surviving Mars. He decided that he will just take one rocket of settlers and that will be it. So whatever these 12 people do, if they can survive on their own and multiply, and that will be it. So this is the only 12 apostles, and he made a playthrough with that, and later on we turned that into a game mode where you can actually play the game by limiting yourself to just one rocket of people. And this is something that we did not think about, but he thought, and he created this story out of the game that we have created. So there is also that to consider, and you can support that within your game with different means. And there is also the stories from the other players that they create for you and for themselves. And anybody playing World of Warcraft or Dota or any multiplayer game will know that there is a lot of stories between players where there is repeated occurrence or even within one single match. And the other players are a huge part of the experience of the game. The presentation of the stories is this is how we deliver them to the players. And we have pretty obvious set of tools that hasn't changed that much throughout the years. This is something very, very stable. Cutscenes, voiceovers and sound, live action, text choices, and from everything here, you can see that only the choices are in fact interactive. Everything else could be interactive as much as the game world is interactive. So if there is an interactive portion that triggers something, then it could be considered kind of interactive, but other than that, it's just a fixed piece of content. And there is, of course, a combination of all of the above. So you can have dialogues, they may or may not have a voiceover, they may or may not have action, cutscenes, text with them, and so on. Also, an escort sequence is just another combination of such elements that you can have in the game. And as you see, the link and the spectrum between a story and actual gameplay mechanics is disappearing, because the escort sequence could be taught as a purely gameplay mechanics things, but at the same time, it's telling a story about how you escorted that person. So there is a blend between the two, and they interact in a very intimate way. The important thing about triggers is that, as everything else, clear, visible, understandable, as non-interrupting the rest of the experience as possible, and also repeating in case you missed them. These are very, very simple things. I just listed them here, so you can use that as a check later on. Also, another point, more interactive means more engaging, and that's absolutely true, but interaction is hard, and sometimes blurs of text are not exactly easier to do, but maybe cheaper, maybe within the amount of resources that you have available. So in the next few days, whoever tries to compete in the game jam, if they have 2 hours before the end, they may consider throwing quickly a story for their game, or maybe an event or two inside that happen, and that can actually improve the whole experience a lot, as the players will look at the game in a completely different way when they have a backstory and a very solid why the character is doing what he's doing. A little bit of examples of all these things that I threw around. Minecraft and Factorio, very good examples of player-created stories, both the overarching story, the game story, and also the sub-stories within the games. There is practically nothing else, but it doesn't mean that these things somehow came about. These games were designed to allow the players to create their own story. And all of the things that are inside are created with that in mind and with that purpose. And whether including this or that feature, if you think about how do you decide whether you have this item or that item in Minecraft? It's a good test to see whether that is able to actually generate stories and put the players in interesting places where they can try to escape or where they feel threatened and so on and so forth. World of Warcraft quests, pretty much sub-stories that you're mostly being told about. After a few of them, you realize that it's pretty much killing X of Y and collecting Z of the drops. At least that's a big part of them, not all of them. Stellaris, it's a game, it's a strategy game, so it's a player-created story, but at the same time inside, there is these different small blurbs of text that show, and they create the entire atmosphere of the game and deliver on the promise of the game of creating this far future fantastic world with a lot of characters and a lot of story, and a lot of things happened before you actually started playing the game. And Tropico, an example from our games, the previous Tropicos have an overarching story that you're being told about. We're delivering that through cutscenes, voiceovers, texts. Then it's the sub-stories that you create. As you play each mission, it's up to you to decide how you're going to approach that, what you're going to build. There is a number of challenges that you have to overcome, and how you do that, it's up to you. And then we have these small, again, events and blurbs of text that appear, which talk about specific things happening, not necessarily having a big relation to everything else, but they do have relation to your game, because there is a number of choices and a number of actions that you can choose from that go back to whatever you're doing and whatever your goal is, and to your chosen approach of completing that. So as you see, there is multiple points where you can include different types of stories and make that in the world, or make that work in the game. And finally, a quick checklist. So if you want to evaluate your game from this perspective, you can think about what stories are there in the game and what stories can improve it. So you can see maybe adding a little bit of backstory, or maybe adding events to the game could make that a lot better. What are the emotions evoked by your stories and how they can can be made better? Sometimes a story sounds very nice on paper when you write it. A lot of times the writer has a little bit of a problem to see the story from the fresh eyes of somebody who isn't exactly having the experience that he had, because we create stories typically copying some parts of our experience, and we tend to mix the impact of the story with the impact of the experience we're copying from. So if something happened to you that was very impactful to you, you can try writing it down, and for you, because it will it will remind you of that experience, it will be very, very strong. But for people who haven't had that experience, it will not remind them of that, so it might not be that effective. So it's a very good way to actually sit down and think, okay, what is the feeling that this story is creating, and how effective is it in doing that, and how can I improve that? Also the presentations, considering where your efforts should go and how you should approach the delivery of your stories, whether it makes sense to just leave them as texts. For example, Faster Than Light, as you know, is a hugely successful game. It has a number of events that are integral part of the game. It would not be what it is without them every time you go to a new place. But those events are just left out as text, and the different options are left out as text. That's it, that's enough. Sometimes that's all you need to do. And sometimes you need 10 million cutscenes. So there is all kinds of choices that you can make, and all kinds of approaches. And then finally, you can check the writing whenever you have text. Very simple tics: concise, visceral, understandable, and hopefully having more action versus description. And that's about it. I tried to somehow condense the 20 years of experience into 20 minutes, so that's my best. Thank you.
Questions?
Any questions?
Anything new coming out from Haemimont Games? Like more action-oriented, maybe a sequel to Victor Vran?
This is a very bad place to announce a new title. No, there is nothing new coming out from us for at least 6 months. Any other questions?
So I have a question about telling a story. I loved your point about the writer's story not always translating to the player due to well, lack of personal experience. Do you think you should QA your story? And how would you go about it if it's not finished yet?
We do QA our stories in a way, but it's not very sort of fixed process. But before we make a story and we write one, we typically talk about it for very long periods of time. Also, we as people tend to like things the moment we have the idea. And so one of the things you can do is to leave it be for a while. So you write it down, leave it be for a few days, then come back to it. If it still excites you, then that's a good sign that it's going to work. Share it with other people. If it excites them, then that's a good thing. Honesty is a big part of it, and because within our design team, we've been on all sides of these things. So the other designers have shut down stories. They liked stories and so on. Because if you tell this to your mother, she will be like, "This is the greatest story I've ever had." That's that's the story. So if you have somebody who have repeatedly listened to your stories, gave you feedback, so you know how to evaluate that feedback, and you know whether maybe that's even okay, maybe it's even good. It depends. So you have to go through that loop several times in order to get a feeling of what it means, and just test it out. And even after all of that, some stories will work and other will be like, a little bit more meh. We always, because we talk internally about the stories that we make a lot, and if somebody doesn't, this is the process that we have, if somebody doesn't like what we're doing, we assume that there is a good reason for it. So we just keep iterating, changing, trying to somehow make everybody agree. That has a very interesting side effects. When we are about to release a game, we're all convinced that this is the absolutely best game that can ever be. And then it hits the market, and the shitstorm happens, as we've learned with Surviving Mars. So it's this is a sort of a side effect of our process, because we really try to make everybody happy. That doesn't mean that 100,000 people will be happy. It means that the 6 people are happy, but we have no one who isn't. So it kind of like this is perfect. It's going to work, and then it doesn't. So again, it's a question of experience, and also it's a question you don't necessarily have to write the only great, amazing 100% stuff. Sometimes you just have to just keep writing, keep improving, and with the time you get a little bit of experience. Sometimes you think you have it, sometimes you think you don't have it. It's like any other creative process, more or less. Hope that answers the question.
But yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for the amazing lecture. It was really good, and thank you for really good quality games you've released in the last long time.
Thank you.
As a player of games like Dwarf Fortress, Crusader Kings, I totally relate with what you just said in the lecture. I've created so many countless memories, emotions, experiences that I can never even imagine would have gotten them when I started playing games. How much of that stays in, when you play your own game, are you still able to experience these stories, or are you too much into the game after you know everything about it? Can you still enjoy your game the way your players do after creating it? Because it's open, you should be able to.
You lose the part where there is a story, because we have been around these stories for so long. I've watched these movies at least 100 times, making small tweaks and stuff inside them. So at the end, they're just pixels, frames. I'm timing as the cuts go, and I'm like, this is too short, or it has to be longer, or whatever. So you stop experiencing the freshness of the story, and that part is forever lost to us. And for anybody working on a game, that part is lost. By the time you ship the game, which is 1 year in development, 2 years into development, you know so much about where these things are coming from that sometimes you're not even sure whether that's part of the game or not. Because, for example, in Victor Run, we have the entire story from how he grew up, why he ended up with this demon thing, what happened afterwards, how he left, and blah, blah, blah. And all of this is just hinted in about 4 sentences thrown out throughout the game, but there is a story about all of this written already, and I don't know what part exactly and how much of it we communicated with people. So it's also with all these revisions, we have probably, I don't know, 50 revisions of the intro text, even though it's just 5 sentences. But in the end, we are literally lost between all these revisions and what exactly is the difference between this one and that one. So the way we do it is we just do it in sprints. We sit down, maybe do 20 revisions, leave that be. Later on, we decide that, okay, we have time that needs improvement. We do another 10 revisions, go over it, leave that be for a few months again, and so on. So that part is lost. The other part, which is the story creation part and the more simulation part, is not lost, and that's something we enjoy in our games. But when I played Surviving Mars, I'm always competing with the clock, and I watch which day I'm doing this, how much time it takes me, and so on and so forth. That's why actually the challenges came about, because the way we play the game is to try to do everything faster. And then there is a whole new game when you try to do it faster, because it's easier to do it eventually. The question is how fast you can do it. So this is how the challenges were born, because internally we were always playing against the clock. You're welcome.
No more questions?
Hello. This is something I see on a lot of guides and a lot of like help forums. When it comes to writing, everyone says you should always write relatable characters. Relatable characters help the reader get into the story. But I've seen a lot of examples, in games and sometimes in movies where there's not exactly a lot of really relatable characters, and they still tell good stories. Say Diablo. I don't relate to angels killing demons really, but it's still a pretty good story in my opinion. So how important really are relatable characters to the quality of your story?
Very, I would say. Okay, I will throw a little bit of arguable things around, so don't burn me at the exit. But I would say that Diablo is perfectly playable if you just delete those cutscenes when you buy the game and just enjoy the game. It's about the loot, about optimizing your character and stuff like that. The exact story tells, I'm sorry about those 10 millions in cutscenes, but I'm personally not deeply moved by that story, and that is not affecting me. This is my personal opinion about it. So, and sometimes when you're making a game, there are so many factors, including when it's launched and what's happening, whether there is an audience that wants exactly this type of game at this moment, and so on and so forth. So even after launching the game, you don't know. It succeeds or fails, and you still don't know why it succeeded or failed. And that's not to mention before that, when we launch our games, we have no clue on the day before we hit, press the button, publish. We have no clue what that game is going to make. Absolutely zero idea. When we were publishing Victor Run, we pressed the button, closed the browser, went on a 2-day retreat, and I completely refused to look at any sales numbers because we did what we could. And then whatever happens, happens. But that's not us anymore. It's we had the time, we thought what we should do with this time, we did what we can, and that's it. And we have absolutely no clue We have read these articles about having only single launch on Steam. There is a very popular article about that. And when you have early access, your early access launch is that launch, that single launch that you have. Then you have no other launch. And there is a lot of titles that just, there is the launch here and it's completely flat line, it's exactly the same after the launch and before the launch. And luckily, we were not one of those titles, and we had a big spike after the launch and so on and so forth. But this, we had no idea whether it's going to happen or not. And if anybody tells you they know, they're just post factum, they know. Before, they didn't. That's it.
Thanks.
Okay, there seems to be no other questions. Thank you very much for the inspiring lecture. Gabriel, Bob, everybody.
Thank you.